Aida for breaking up with my fiancée for telling her best friend she was not engaged? I remember the first time I met Emma. It was one of those moments that stick with you. The kind you replay over and over in your mind. She was smart, confident, with a wit that caught me off guard in the best way. I'd always admired that about her. The way she seemed to know exactly who she was and what she wanted out of life. We started dating soon after. And over the next 5 years, we built a life together, weaving our dreams and routines into something that felt solid, reliable. Emma and I had dreams, too, about the kind of life we wanted to build. Over countless nights, we'd talk about the house we'd live in someday, the vacations we'd take, the future we'd create. I had grown up in a family that wasn't always close. So having this vision, this shared future, felt like a promise I didn't want to let go of. Emma seemed to understand that part of me, and I thought she shared it. I wasn't in a rush to get married, though. Finances were tight, and I wanted to be able to give her the wedding she always dreamed of. I knew it wasn't about the money. Not really, but I wanted that day to be special. I wanted her to feel like she was stepping into the future she deserved. So, I worked hard, took on extra hours, saved every bit I could, all with the goal of making that dream a reality. When I finally had enough saved, I started planning. I wanted the proposal to be a surprise but also something that felt right for us. Nothing flashy or staged, just a quiet, private moment that would capture everything we'd built together. I remember the look in her eyes when I got down on one knee. The way she seemed genuinely moved, almost as if she hadn't fully realized how much this moment meant until it was right in front of her. She said yes, and we celebrated that night, just the two of us. Our own little world filled with dreams and laughter. For the next 3 weeks, everything felt like a whirlwind of excitement. We'd finally taken the step that we'd talked about for years. And now we were planning a wedding. The guest list, the venue, the details that would make it feel like ours. It was a lot, but I was willing to take on whatever I needed to. I wanted her to have her perfect day, and I wanted to be the one to give it to her. We were on the same page about almost everything. The guest list was something she wanted to keep intimate, just family and close friends, and I completely agreed. But there was one person I felt we couldn't leave out, her best friend. James. They'd been friends for over 10 years. And though I hadn't always understood the depth of their friendship, I knew he was important to her. Over time, I'd come to accept that James was part of her life. Someone who had been there through thick and thin. Including him felt like the right thing to do. A way of honoring the history she brought into our relationship. So, I asked her if she wanted to invite him, even offering to cover the travel expenses since he lived out of state. I wanted to make sure she knew this was her day. Her happiness that mattered most to me. In a way, it was my way of showing her that I'd accepted her friendships. Even the ones that sometimes made me uneasy. What she said next took me by surprise. She shrugged, saying it wasn't necessary to invite him. That she wanted to keep the wedding small. Just family. I was caught off guard, given how many times she'd called him, like family. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe she just didn't want to complicate things. Still, the thought lingered. This was her best friend. Someone she talked about with such loyalty. And yet she hadn't even told him about our engagement. It seemed small, but there was something about it I couldn't shake. The thought that she was keeping this part of her life, a huge part, separate from him felt strange. Out of character. It wasn't like her to keep secrets. At least not from him. And as I sat there, trying to make sense of it, I felt a pang of doubt. Something I hadn't expected to feel. Something that quietly but persistently told me that maybe I didn't know everything about the person I was about to marry. Over the next couple of days, I found myself circling back to that moment, her casual dismissal of inviting James, and the revelation that she hadn't even told him we were engaged. I'd known about James for as long as Emma and I had been together. He wasn't just a passing mention in conversation, he was a fixture in her life. Someone she had shared years of friendship with before she even met me. I'd heard countless stories about their time together in college. The silly adventures, the deep talks, and all the moments that made him feel, to her, like family. James was more than just a best friend. Though, a few years into our relationship, Emma had told me about his confession. He had feelings for her. And by her account, he had wanted more than friendship. She assured me that she'd turned him down. That they'd both agreed to stay friends and nothing more. She even laughed about how he was friend-zoned for life, and that nothing could change that. But there was something about the way she talked about him, a certain fondness in her tone, that left me feeling unsettled. Maybe it was just my insecurities getting the best of me, but there were moments when I couldn't help but wonder if she kept him in her life as a backup. A familiar comfort that was always waiting in the background. Her words alone never fully convinced me. And when she admitted to having married him online in a video game years ago, complete with matching outfits for their characters and all, it felt strange. Even a bit too intimate for two people who claimed to be nothing more than friends. Whenever she'd had issues with past boyfriends, she always turned to James for support, which, at the time, made me feel a bit uneasy. I told myself that it was only natural, they'd been friends for so long. And of course, she'd rely on him for advice. But a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he held a place in her life that extended beyond friendship. It wasn't jealousy. Exactly. It was more the sense that there was something about him that Emma wasn't fully willing to let go of. With all of this swirling around in my mind, I decided to approach the subject with her again. It was hard to ignore the tension building inside me, but I knew that letting it fester wouldn't do any good. I asked her why she hadn't told James about the engagement, hoping for a simple explanation that would put my worries to rest. But instead of a straightforward answer, she seemed almost defensive, brushing off the question with vague excuses. "He's busy," she said, her tone dismissive. "He lives out of state. And I don't see the point in complicating things." I pushed a bit more, gently trying to understand. "But he's your best friend. You've known each other for years. Wouldn't he want to know that you're getting married?" Her response was curt, almost annoyed. "I just haven't told him. Okay, can we drop it?" I could feel the frustration rising within me. It wasn't like I was asking for much, just an honest explanation. Yet her unwillingness to talk about it made me feel as if I was overstepping, intruding on something she wanted to keep hidden. Her reaction was unlike her. She was usually open, always willing to talk things through. But this time, she was closed off, unwilling to give me the clarity I needed. The more she deflected, the more my mind wandered to all the things I tried to ignore: the online marriage, the confessions from James, the quiet, unspoken understanding they shared that I'd never been a part of. I didn't want to let my insecurities take control, but I couldn't help but feel that I was standing on the outside of something important. Something that she hadn't fully let go of. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the conversation in my head, wondering why she couldn't just give me a straight answer. We were supposed to be partners, sharing everything openly and honestly. But here she was, keeping something as significant as our engagement from the person she'd always considered like family. It made no sense, and I could feel my doubts settling in, taking root in places I thought were secure. In those quiet moments, a thought began to form, unbidden but persistent. Maybe, deep down, she didn't feel as committed to this as I did. Maybe, just maybe, there was a part of her that still saw James as something more than a friend. A part of her that wasn't ready to let go of the past. The realization shook me, filling me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I wanted to be wrong, to convince myself that this was just a misunderstanding. But as I lay there, alone with my thoughts, I couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a miscommunication. It was a sign, a crack in the foundation of our relationship. And no matter how much I wanted to ignore it, I knew I had to confront it. Over the next day or so, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that had settled in. It was as if a barrier had gone up between us, something invisible, but impenetrable. Each time I tried to push through, to get some clarity, Emma's responses only pushed me further away. I wanted to believe this was just a misunderstanding, a moment of doubt that would fade if we could simply talk it out. But every time I tried, she'd change the subject or dismiss my concerns. The tension began to build, not just in our conversations, but in the atmosphere between us. What should have been a time filled with excitement and planning had turned into an uncomfortable silence, where every word felt loaded, every gesture scrutinized. I found myself questioning things I'd never questioned before, dissecting her actions, her reactions, searching for answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. The worst part was feeling as though I was losing my sense of stability, that everything I thought I knew about our relationship was being called into question. I'd always trusted her, always believed that we were on the same page about our future. But now, faced with her evasiveness, I felt like I was standing on shaky ground, unsure of where we truly stood. After a couple of days of this silent tug of war, I decided to confront her again. I waited until we were both calm, hoping this time would be different. As carefully as I could, I asked her once more why she hadn't told James about our engagement. I tried to keep my tone even, to give her space to explain, hoping she'd see that I just needed honesty. But she didn't answer. She just looked at me with a flash of irritation, crossing her arms as if she were guarding something precious, something she didn't want me to see. And when I pushed a little harder, trying to help her understand how much this was bothering me, she clammed up completely, stonewalling me in a way I'd never experienced with her before. I felt my patience slipping. After all the years of building trust, of being open and vulnerable, this wall she'd put up felt like a betrayal. I was reaching out to her, offering her the chance to clear the air, to give me reassurance, but she was refusing to meet me halfway. It hurt, more than I wanted to admit. And as I stood there, waiting for a response that wasn't coming, I felt my insecurities bubble up to the surface. It wasn't just about James, or about who she was telling about our engagement. It was about the years I'd spent supporting her, the sacrifices I'd made to build a life with her, the vision we shared of a future together. I'd thought I was her partner, the one she trusted most. And yet here I was, standing on the outside, watching her guard a piece of herself that she seemed unwilling to share. Unable to contain my frustration, I told her, with a hint of anger in my voice, that I needed an answer. I told her that if she was going to keep secrets, to hide parts of herself from me, then maybe we weren't as ready for marriage as I'd thought. It was a desperate statement, born out of the pain of feeling excluded. But in that moment, I felt like I needed to take a stand, to show her that honesty was non-negotiable. Instead of responding with the vulnerability I'd hoped for, she did something that left me completely stunned. She took out her phone, opened a text message to James, and, with an almost defiant expression, typed out, "Hey, just so you know, I was engaged, but not anymore." She showed it to me as she sent it, her face set in a mixture of frustration and defiance. I felt the words hit me like a punch to the gut. She hadn't answered my questions, hadn't even tried to explain. Instead, she'd dismissed our engagement, the commitment we'd made to each other, as if it were some trivial arrangement, something that could be discarded with a text message. My heart sank as I realized the depth of the disconnect between us, the lack of understanding that had somehow grown into a chasm. In that moment, I felt humiliated, betrayed, and deeply hurt. She hadn't just avoided the conversation, she'd used it as a weapon, a way to cut me down without saying a word. I stared at her, unable to recognize the person standing in front of me. This was the woman I'd planned to marry, the person I'd spent years building a life with. And yet, in one impulsive action, she'd shown me just how fragile our connection truly was. Without another word, I told her to pack her things and leave. It wasn't a decision I'd made lightly, it was the culmination of days of doubt, of feeling pushed aside, of watching her prioritize someone else's feelings over mine. I needed her to understand that I wasn't willing to compromise on honesty, that I deserved to be treated as her equal, her partner, not as an afterthought. As she packed her things, a strange numbness washed over me. I couldn't tell if I was relieved or devastated, but I knew that something fundamental had broken between us. I'd loved her with everything I had, given her my trust, my loyalty, my dreams, and in return, she'd chosen to protect a friendship that, to her, was worth more than the future we'd planned. When she left, the silence that filled the house was almost unbearable. I could still feel the weight of her presence, the ghost of the life we'd shared lingering in every corner. I wanted to feel anger, to let the pain turn into something easier to bear. But all I felt was emptiness, a hollow ache that left me questioning everything I thought I knew. As the hours passed, I began to wonder if I'd made the right choice. Had I overreacted? Was I wrong to end things over what others might see as a small issue? But deep down, I knew it wasn't about James, or about her not telling him. It was about honesty, about the openness I needed in a partner, the trust that had been chipped away each time she refused to let me in. In that quiet, empty house, I began to accept that maybe this was the way it had to be. If I couldn't be with someone who valued transparency, then maybe I was better off alone. However painful the truth might be, I'd lost her, yes, but maybe, in a strange way, I'd found something even more important: my own boundaries, my own self-respect. After she left, the silence in the house weighed on me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Every room, every little detail, Felt like a reminder of the life I'd planned and lost. Her side of the closet, now empty, seemed almost like a blank canvas of what could have been, and each glance felt like a fresh wound, a reminder that things would never go back to the way they were. The first night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was caught in an endless loop of second-guessing, replaying our last conversation, wondering if I'd been unreasonable or if I'd let my insecurities get the best of me. I'd asked her to leave, sure, but now I wasn't so sure I'd made the right choice. There were flashes of anger, then regret, and a gnawing emptiness that kept pulling me back to the same question: had I overreacted? Part of me wanted to call her, to see if there was anything left to salvage. I picked up my phone a dozen times, my thumb hovering over her number. But each time, I stopped myself. I didn't know what I'd say. I didn't even know if I'd get the answers I needed. The uncertainty was paralyzing, leaving me in a state of emotional limbo, where I wasn't entirely ready to move on. But I couldn't see a way forward with her, either. The following morning, the questions from my mom began. Emma had called her, venting about what had happened, spinning the story in a way that made me sound petty and unreasonable. My mom, usually supportive, seemed baffled by my decision. Why end things over something so small? She asked. You've been together for 5 years, planning a future together. Don't throw it all away over a misunderstanding. Her words hit me hard, intensifying my guilt. Was it truly that insignificant? Was I throwing away something beautiful over what others saw as a minor issue? I began to wonder if I was the only one who saw the situation this way. Who felt the weight of her secrecy and lack of transparency? My mom's words replayed in my mind, adding to the doubt that was already gnawing at me. Over the next few days, friends and family reached out, each with their own perspective, their own take on the situation. Some told me I'd overreacted, that I was being insecure and should have just let it go. Others understood my side, validating my feelings of betrayal and emphasizing that a marriage should be built on trust and openness. But no matter what they said, none of it seemed to bring me any closer to a resolution. The house began to feel like a prison, filled with memories of her, of us, of everything we'd shared. It was hard to focus on anything else. I'd find myself caught in random moments, staring at a photo of us on the wall, or seeing the coffee mug she'd always used sitting in the sink. Each reminder made the ache sharper, the regret deeper, as I wrestled with the fear that maybe I'd thrown away the best thing I'd ever had. One evening, in the thick of my doubt, I found myself replaying our relationship in my mind, analyzing every detail, every moment that had once felt secure and certain. I thought back to times when I'd sensed a distance between us, when she'd chosen to confide in James over me, and each memory felt like a piece of a puzzle I'd missed. The realization struck me that I'd been ignoring signs all along, choosing to believe that we were solid, that our love was enough to withstand anything. I couldn't shake the feeling that her friendship with James had been more than just a platonic connection. It was something deeper, something she'd never been fully honest about. Each memory of her brushing off my concerns, dismissing my feelings as jealousy, felt like a betrayal I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. It was as though I'd been looking at our relationship through rose-colored glasses, refusing to see the cracks that had always been there. But even as I acknowledged these doubts, the pain of losing her was real, raw, and unyielding. I had loved her, genuinely, with everything I had, and now that she was gone, I felt hollow. The life we'd planned together, the future I'd saved and worked so hard for, had vanished in an instant. I'd been willing to forgive, to compromise, to overlook things that bothered me because I believed in our love. But her refusal to let me in, to be honest about something as monumental as our engagement, had shattered that belief, leaving me questioning everything. I started to avoid people, retreating into myself, unable to bear the constant reminders of what had happened. Friends would ask if I was okay, if I'd talked to her, if there was a chance we'd reconcile. Each question felt like salt in the wound, a painful reminder that the life I'd known, the woman I'd loved, was now a stranger. At night, I'd lie awake, haunted by the image of her texting James, dismissing our engagement like it was nothing. I wondered if I'd ever really known her, if the person I'd loved was just a figment of my imagination. The doubt was paralyzing, eating away at me, and yet, in the midst of it all, I felt a glimmer of clarity. I realized that, despite the pain, I couldn't go back. The trust we'd built had been fractured in a way that couldn't be repaired. And no amount of apologies or explanations would change that. I'd loved her, yes, but I loved myself enough to know that I deserved better than secrecy and half-truths. I deserved a partner who would be honest, who would value our relationship enough to put it above everything else. In that moment, I understood that this was the end, not because of what she had done, but because of what it revealed about us. Our relationship had been built on love, yes, but it lacked the foundation of trust, of mutual respect that I now knew was essential. I didn't hate her, I still cared for her deeply, and maybe part of me always would, but I also knew that this was a chance to reclaim my own worth. To build a life where I wouldn't have to question my partner's loyalty or transparency. As I lay there, finally allowing myself to feel the weight of the decision I'd made, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was painful, yes, and I knew the days ahead would be hard, but I also knew that I was doing the right thing, choosing to honor myself in a way I hadn't before. I would grieve the loss, but I would come out stronger, more certain of what I deserved, and ready to build a life on a foundation of trust. With or without her. As the days drifted by, I began to replay moments from our relationship with a clarity I hadn't had before. I'd always known that Emma's friendship with James was complicated, but I'd convinced myself that it was harmless. That love meant trusting her judgment. I'd wanted so badly to be the type of person who could see past insecurities, who could believe in the strength of our relationship despite its flaws. But now, with space and distance, I started to see those warning signs for what they were. There were countless times she'd told me about her history with James, how he'd been there during hard times, how he'd always understood her in ways other people couldn't. But she'd also mentioned things in passing, details that seemed small at the time but now took on new meaning. She'd joked about their online marriage, sharing stories of how their game characters would look like a couple. Even when she was in a relationship with someone else, each time she'd mentioned it, I'd laugh along, brushing off the discomfort that crept in. I thought it was my own insecurity, an unfair jealousy that didn't belong in a trusting relationship. Then there were the times she'd confided in him after arguments with her exes. When she first told me about James confessing his feelings, I thought she was being honest, letting me in on something from her past. I never suspected that it was still relevant, that maybe those old feelings hadn't entirely faded away. I trusted her, thinking it was just a story of unrequited love, something they'd moved beyond, but in hindsight, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it. If she'd kept him around as some kind of safety net, a backup in case her romantic relationships didn't work out. The memories built up, one after another, like pieces of a puzzle that had finally started to fit together. The signs had been there all along, her defensiveness when I brought up James, the way she'd brush off my concerns, telling me I was being paranoid. Each time, I'd pushed my feelings down, telling myself I was overreacting. That trust meant letting her have her friendships without questioning her. I thought love meant looking past these small inconsistencies, choosing to see only the good, the potential, the future I wanted so badly to believe in. But now, without her there to brush off my doubts, I began to see things as they really were. It wasn't just about James, it was about honesty. About being with someone who could be open and transparent, who valued our relationship enough to share every part of herself with me. And in Emma's case, that hadn't happened. She'd kept parts of herself separate, tucked away, as if our relationship was only one piece of her life, not the whole picture. This realization was painful, but it was also freeing. I'd spent so long trying to mold myself into someone who could live with these small betrayals, who could look past the cracks in our relationship and still find wholeness. But now, I saw the cost of that kind of love, the quiet, unspoken resentment, the erosion of self-trust as I kept denying what I felt deep down. Friends and family kept reaching out, offering their own takes on the situation, trying to either reassure me or gently suggest that maybe I'd been too hasty. But as well-intentioned as their words were, they didn't change the truth I was finally facing, that I'd spent years ignoring the instincts that had whispered to me all along. One night, as I lay in bed, I recalled a conversation I'd had with an old friend just a few months before I proposed. He'd asked me if I was certain Emma was the one, if I felt secure with her. At the time, I'd laughed it off, saying, "Of course, we love each other." But now, I remembered the hint of concern in his eyes, the way he'd looked at me as if he saw something I wasn't ready to admit to myself. It was a small moment, one I'd brushed off, But now it stood out as another instance of my own denial. Maybe, in some way, I'd been so focused on giving Emma what she wanted, on being the partner she needed, that I'd neglected my own needs, my own values. I'd sacrificed my comfort, my boundaries, thinking it was what love demanded. But the truth was, love shouldn't ask you to compromise your own peace of mind, to silence your intuition just to keep the peace. This revelation hurt, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. I felt a shift within me, a quiet determination to honor my own worth, to trust the instincts I'd silenced for so long. I knew now that I couldn't be with someone who wasn't willing to meet me in the middle, who held parts of themselves back out of fear or obligation. I didn't hate Emma, not even close. In many ways, I still loved her, still cared about the future she would have, even if it wasn't with me. But I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Our relationship had been a journey, one filled with love and growth, but also with unspoken compromises, silent sacrifices that had left their mark. And as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't go back, couldn't pretend that these revelations hadn't changed me. In the quiet of that realization, I felt a strange, bittersweet sense of closure. This was the end of a chapter, one that had taught me more about myself than I'd ever expected. I was grieving, yes, but I was also beginning to understand that sometimes love isn't enough, not when it comes at the expense of trust, of self-respect, of knowing you deserve someone who will stand by you openly, without reservations or hidden corners of their heart. That night, for the first time since she'd left, I slept peacefully, finally free of the doubts that had haunted me for so long. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I was ready to face it, armed with a newfound respect for myself and a commitment to never settle for anything less than honesty. No matter how painful the journey to find it might be, the peace I'd felt after that night of clarity was fleeting. As soon as I thought I'd found my footing, doubt would creep back in, eroding whatever small sense of stability I'd managed to build. Each day brought a new layer of uncertainty, a question I hadn't yet asked myself, a fresh ache as I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Part of the doubt came from the reactions of the people closest to me. Friends and family seemed divided in their opinions, some supporting my decision and affirming that trust was paramount, while others hinted that maybe I'd been too harsh, too quick to pull the trigger. My mom's voice rang louder than anyone else's. She kept asking if I'd tried to understand Emma's side, if I'd considered that maybe she had her reasons for not being fully transparent. "It's a friendship," my mom had said on one of her calls. "People have different ways of maintaining relationships. It doesn't mean she didn't love you." The words stung. I'd already gone over the possibility that maybe I'd overreacted, that I'd let my own insecurities ruin something good. Was it possible that Emma's behavior was innocent, that her secrecy wasn't as harmful as I'd perceived it to be? My mom's comment echoed in my mind, bringing up feelings I thought I'd managed to put to rest. In those moments, I questioned everything I thought I'd learned. I started to feel like I'd failed not only Emma, but myself. Like I'd walked away because I couldn't deal with my own insecurities. What if she genuinely cared for me but simply didn't know how to navigate the delicate balance between her friendship with James and her relationship with me? What if I'd misread her actions as a betrayal when, in reality, they were just different forms of loyalty? These thoughts kept me up at night, tugging at the edges of my decision, gnawing away at whatever peace I'd found. But there was another part of me, a quieter, stronger voice that reminded me of the years I'd spent questioning, doubting, feeling as though something was always just slightly out of reach. That voice reminded me that I hadn't made this choice on a whim. I'd reached a breaking point, a place where my self-respect demanded action, where my need for honesty had finally outweighed my fear of being alone. It was a strange, exhausting inner battle, one that left me oscillating between resolve and regret. On one hand, I understood that my boundaries were valid, that I had a right to expect transparency from the person I was going to marry. But on the other hand, I felt guilty, as if I'd been unfair, as if I should have been more patient, more understanding of her need to navigate her relationships in her own way. There were moments when I'd almost convince myself to reach out to her, to try and explain my side, to see if there was anything left to salvage. But each time, I'd hold back, remembering the look on her face when she'd texted James. That look had said more than any words could. It had shown me a part of her that I wasn't sure I could ever reconcile with. A side of her that didn't respect my feelings, that had chosen defiance over understanding. As the days passed, I began to realize that my doubt wasn't really about Emma. It was about my own struggle to stand by my decision, to trust myself despite the voices around me telling me I might be wrong. I'd spent so long doubting myself, ignoring my own needs to make someone else happy, that now, in this moment of choosing myself, I was struggling to believe I'd done the right thing. One afternoon, in an attempt to clear my mind, I decided to go for a run. It was something I hadn't done in weeks, but I needed a release, something physical to ground me. As I ran, I thought about the past 5 years, about the countless ways I'd compromised, the times I'd ignored my own discomfort for the sake of keeping the peace. With each step, I felt a weight lifting, a reminder that I hadn't been unreasonable. I'd been asking for the bare minimum: honesty, respect, transparency. When I returned home, sweaty and exhausted, I felt a bit of the fog lift. I realized that the responsibility I felt wasn't for Emma or for the relationship I'd ended. It was for myself, for the commitment I'd made to live authentically, to value my own needs as much as I valued those of the person I loved. Maybe I hadn't failed her, maybe I'd finally done right by myself. In the days that followed, I tried to embrace that perspective. I reminded myself that standing up for my own boundaries wasn't a failure, and that sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that bring us closer to the person we're meant to be. I'd spent so long trying to fit into a mold of who I thought Emma needed me to be, that I'd forgotten to honor the person I already was. Slowly, as I began to accept my decision, I found a new kind of peace, one that wasn't dependent on anyone else's validation. It was fragile, tentative, but it was mine. I realized that the real responsibility I held wasn't to fix or save the relationship, but to learn from it, to understand that love, while beautiful, wasn't enough if it came at the expense of my own self-worth. The doubts didn't disappear overnight, and there were still moments of regret, times when I missed her, when I wondered what might have been, but with each day, I felt a little stronger, a little more certain that I'd done the right thing. I'd chosen myself, finally, and that was something worth holding on to. As word spread among our circle of friends and family, I started receiving messages from people who'd heard about the breakup. Most were supportive or curious, asking if I was okay or wanting to know what had happened. But some of the responses threw me off, challenging the reasoning I thought was clear and justified. Some couldn't believe I'd ended things over what seemed, from the outside, like a minor issue, while others defended Emma, saying I'd been too hard on her. The mixed responses only deepened my confusion. One friend, who had been close to both of us, said outright, "Maybe you should have let this go. People have complicated friendships, and not every little thing has to make sense to you." He meant well, but his words stuck with me, leaving me unsettled. I thought my reasons were simple. I needed honesty, transparency, and a sense of security in my relationship. But hearing others say I'd been unreasonable made me question myself all over again. Had I expected too much? Was I holding Emma to a standard she couldn't meet? The doubts began to build again, pulling me back into the whirlwind of second-guessing. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about calling her, about trying to piece things back together. I imagined telling her that maybe I'd overreacted, that maybe we could find a way to move forward. But just as I reached for my phone, I stopped, reminded of the hurt I'd felt when she dismissed our engagement so easily. That feeling of betrayal, of being dismissed, was still fresh, still raw. I realized that calling her would only drag me back into a situation that had already caused so much pain. The following weekend, a close friend invited me out for coffee. He'd been there through it all, from when Emma and I first started dating to our engagement. As we talked, he looked at me seriously and asked, "Are you regretting ending things? Or are you regretting not understanding her sooner?" The question was a wake-up call. It forced me to look at my feelings from a new angle, to separate my attachment to Emma from my need for closure and understanding. After our conversation, I took a long walk to clear my head. I realized that the regret I was feeling wasn't about losing her, it was about the time and energy I'd spent trying to make sense of her friendship with James. About all the years I'd ignored my own instincts. I hadn't been wrong to expect honesty, but I'd been wrong to ignore the discomfort that had been building within me for so long. I'd been so focused on being the understanding partner, the one who could overlook insecurities, that I'd failed to honor my own boundaries. As I walked, I felt a weight lifting. I realized that the clarity I was searching for wasn't going to come from anyone else's opinion, not from my mom, my friends, or even Emma. It had to come from me. From my willingness to accept that I had acted in my own best interest, even if others couldn't fully understand why. In the days that followed, I reached out to a few more friends, not to explain myself, but to listen to what they had to say, to gain different perspectives without letting them sway me. I wanted to understand why some people felt I'd overreacted and why others thought I was justified. I learned that everyone had their own biases, their own experiences shaping how they viewed the situation. Some had been in controlling relationships and saw my reaction as an attempt to establish control. Others had dealt with dishonesty in their own lives and understood the importance of transparency. Through these conversations, I began to see that relationships are deeply personal, unique to each individual. No one else could fully grasp the nuances of what Emma and I shared or the depth of my feelings when I'd made the decision to end things. The clarity I was searching for wouldn't come from someone else validating my decision but from my own acceptance that I'd done what I felt was right, based on my values and needs. One evening, after a particularly long day, I sat alone in my living room, reflecting on the journey I'd been through. The initial pain of losing Emma, the anger, the regret, the doubt, all of it had been a part of my healing, my growth. I realized that breaking up with her hadn't just been about our engagement or her friendship with James. It had been about finally listening to myself, trusting that my own feelings were valid, that my needs deserved to be respected. In that moment, I found a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in weeks. I knew that the decision to end things had been difficult, and I accepted that it wouldn't make sense to everyone else. But I didn't need it to. I didn't need to justify my choice to anyone, because I'd finally come to terms with it myself. I thought about Emma and James, about the friendship that had caused so much confusion, and realized that maybe she'd never meant to hurt me. Maybe, in her own way, she'd tried to balance two parts of her life that didn't quite fit together. But that wasn't my burden to carry anymore. I could let go of the anger, the disappointment, the feeling that I'd been betrayed. I didn't have to understand her reasons, I just had to understand my own. As I sat there, I felt a renewed sense of self-worth, a commitment to honoring my own needs in future relationships. I'd learned a hard lesson, but it was one that would guide me moving forward. I wasn't just a man who had lost his fiancée. I was someone who had finally chosen to respect himself enough to walk away from something that didn't align with his values. I realized that the only perspective I truly needed was my own. I could respect the opinions of others, listen to their advice, but ultimately, the choices I made were mine alone. And in that acceptance, I found a strange but profound peace, knowing that no matter what anyone else thought, I'd done what was best for me. The weeks that followed were full of moments of clarity, sometimes painful but always necessary. I hadn't fully realized it at first, but ending things with Emma had forced me to confront a lot about myself, about who I'd become and what I was willing to accept in a relationship. My feelings toward her began to shift from the initial anger and betrayal to something quieter, more reflective. It wasn't that I'd forgiven everything or magically moved on, but the sharp edges of my grief had softened into a more manageable weight. There were still days when I missed her, though. Certain songs, certain places, certain smells would bring it all back, and I'd feel the familiar tug of regret. I'd catch myself wondering what might have been, if only we'd handled things differently. Sometimes, I even felt guilty for leaving her over something that, in hindsight, could be seen as small by others. Those moments of self-doubt were the hardest, gnawing at me like I'd walked away too quickly, too easily. But then, as soon as those thoughts crept in, I'd remind myself of all the little ways I'd bent myself to make things work. The ways I'd downplayed my needs to avoid conflict. I'd never asked for much, just honesty, respect, and the feeling of being her priority. And if that had been too much for her to give, then maybe we hadn't been right for each other after all. As I grew more accustomed to life without Emma, I found that I was learning to love parts of myself that I hadn't fully embraced before. I took up hobbies that I'd put on hold for years, like hiking and photography, interests I'd let fall by the wayside while trying to be the ideal partner. In a strange way, being alone allowed me to reconnect with myself, to discover who I was outside of the relationship. There was a peace in that, a small but profound joy in being able to make choices without compromise, without having to consider anyone else's needs but my own. Around this time, I met up with an old friend for dinner. She'd gone through her own breakup the year before, and as we shared stories and a few laughs over how love can turn out to be so different from what we expected, she looked at me and said, Sometimes, you have to break your own heart to find out who you really are. Her words stuck with me. I realized that, in a way, I had broken my own heart by choosing to end things with Emma. But through that choice, I'd learned more about myself than I ever could have within the relationship. I'd learned what I truly needed. And more importantly, I'd learned what I wasn't willing to sacrifice. As the days turned into weeks, I came to accept that my decision had been the right one. No matter how painful, I'd chosen my own peace, my own sanity, over a love that left me questioning my worth. And in that choice, I'd found a new sense of strength, a confidence that came not from anyone else's validation, but from within. I'd known Emma for 5 years, shared some of my best memories with her, but I could now see that I'd also spent much of that time ignoring parts of myself to make the relationship work. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. I was committed to building a future on my own terms. One where I wouldn't have to silence my doubts or overlook red flags to keep someone in my life. Eventually, I made the final choice to let go of the past entirely. I removed the photos of us from my phone, packed away the mementos of our time together, and stopped revisiting the places that reminded me of her. It wasn't an act of erasure but rather one of acceptance, a way of creating space in my life for new experiences, new memories that weren't weighed down by the shadows of what had been. As I look back on my time with Emma, I felt a mixture of gratitude and closure. She had been a part of my journey, a part of my growth, but she was no longer the center of it. I was free to move forward, unencumbered by regret or lingering resentment. The love I'd felt for her would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. In the end, I realized that my final choice hadn't been about her at all, it had been about me. I'd chosen to value my own needs, to trust my instincts, and to build a life that honored my worth. It was a choice I could stand by. A choice that allowed me to walk away from the relationship not as a victim of heartbreak, but as someone who had learned to love himself enough to let go. And with that, I was finally ready to close this chapter of my life, embracing the unknown future that lay ahead, confident that whatever came next, I'd face it with an open heart and a steadfast commitment to my own happiness. With the weight of my decision behind me, I felt like I was finally stepping into a new chapter. For the first time in years, I was living life on my own terms, without the constant tug of someone else's expectations. It felt strange and liberating all at once. I'd had a vision for my future with Emma, and letting go of that vision had been the hardest thing I'd ever done. But now, with the future wide open, I found myself excited by the possibilities. In small ways, I started to embrace this freedom. I began taking road trips to nearby towns, exploring places I'd always wanted to visit but had never found the time for. I spent afternoons at local coffee shops, reading books that had been sitting on my shelf for years. Each new experience felt like a step toward reclaiming parts of myself that I'd left behind in the pursuit of our relationship. I started reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in ages, people who'd drifted away as Emma and I became the center of each other's worlds. At first, it felt awkward, like I was a stranger in my own social circle. But as we laughed over old stories and shared new experiences, I realized how much I'd missed having my own community. I began to see that, while love had consumed me in a way that felt all-encompassing, friendship had a way of grounding me, reminding me of who I was outside of my relationship. One evening, after spending a day hiking with a couple of close friends, I sat on my porch, looking out at the stars. I realized that for the first time, I wasn't weighed down by sadness or regret. Instead, I felt hopeful, like the universe was gently guiding me towards something I hadn't been able to see before. I felt grateful for the journey I'd been on, for the lessons I'd learned along the way. Each heartbreak, each doubt, each moment of insecurity had been a stepping stone, a path leading me to this very moment of clarity. There was one more thing I needed to do to truly embrace this new beginning. I knew that I had to reach out to Emma, not to rekindle anything or stir up the past, but to offer her a genuine goodbye, a sense of closure that would allow us both to move forward. I'd come to terms with our ending, but I wanted to leave things in a way that reflected the love and respect we'd once shared. Rather than the resentment that had clouded our last days together, I sent her a simple message, one that took me a while to compose but ultimately felt right. I thanked her for the time we'd spent together, for the memories we'd created, and for the lessons she'd taught me about love and honesty. I wished her happiness, genuinely hoping that she'd find the peace and fulfillment we hadn't been able to offer each other. After hitting send, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Like I'd finally laid to rest a chapter of my life that had lingered too long. She replied a few hours later, with a short, polite message expressing her gratitude and wishing me well. It wasn't emotional or nostalgic. It was just a simple exchange between two people who had once meant the world to each other but had now drifted onto separate paths. And that was enough. I didn't need anything more from her. And I realized that this closure, this sense of peace, had come from within me, not from any external validation. As I closed my phone, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in months. I was ready to move forward, to embrace whatever life had in store. I knew there would be days when the memories would resurface, moments when I'd feel the sting of regret or the ache of longing. But I also knew that I had the strength to face those moments, to honor them without letting them define me. This journey had been about learning to value myself, to trust my own worth and instincts. It had taught me that love, as beautiful as it is, should never come at the expense of self-respect. I had chosen to walk away from a relationship that didn't align with my values. And in doing so, I had chosen myself. And now, as I stood on the edge of this new beginning, I felt ready to embrace it fully, with an open heart and an unwavering commitment to my own happiness. The future was unknown, unpredictable, and for the first time, that didn't scare me. I felt free, like I was finally living authentically, unburdened by the expectations or judgments of others. I was stepping into a life that was entirely mine, a life shaped by the choices I'd made, by the lessons I'd learned, and by the strength I'd found within myself. And as I looked out at the world, I felt a quiet, unshakable joy, a joy that came not from someone else's love or approval, but from my own resilience, my own growth, my own journey. In the months that followed, my life shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd braced myself for loneliness, for pangs of longing, and for the hollow feeling that often comes after a breakup. But instead, I felt grounded, more at peace with myself than I ever had been. Each day felt like an opportunity, a chance to explore parts of myself that I'd ignored or forgotten during the years I'd spent with Emma. My friends and family, who had initially been concerned, gradually began to notice the change in me. They saw that I was happier, more present, and more engaged in life. I wasn't weighed down by doubts or the silent fears that had plagued me throughout my relationship. I was free to be myself, to explore who I was outside the confines of a partnership. And I found that I liked this version of myself. In time, I started setting new goals, making plans for a future that was no longer defined by someone else's dreams or expectations. I threw myself into work, focusing on my career and taking on projects I'd once shied away from. I also picked up new hobbies, reconnecting with the passions I'd once had but had neglected over the years. I even started volunteering at a local community center, something I'd always wanted to do but had never found the time for. Each of these small steps added layers of fulfillment to my life, reminding me that happiness wasn't something I had to search for in someone else. It was something I could cultivate within myself. Gradually, I began to see the ending of my relationship with Emma not as a failure, but as a necessary step toward growth. It was a hard truth to accept, but I realized that we hadn't been right for each other, that our love had been real but ultimately incompatible with who we each were becoming. I could look back on our time together with fondness, with gratitude for the memories we'd shared, while also acknowledging that it was time to move forward. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, on all the lessons I'd learned. I thought about the importance of self-respect, of setting boundaries and honoring them. Even when it's hard, I thought about how love, while powerful, should never demand that we compromise our own values or silence our instincts. And I realized that, through this journey, I discovered a strength within myself that I hadn't known existed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over everything, I felt a sense of closure settle within me. I was no longer defined by the heartbreak, no longer haunted by what could have been. Instead, I was looking forward, eager to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead. I didn't know what the future held, and for the first time, I was okay with that. I was open to the unknown, ready to meet new people, to create new memories, and to build a life that reflected my true self. I'd let go of the need to control or predict every outcome, choosing instead to trust in the journey, to have faith that everything would unfold as it was meant to. And as I sat there, Alone but content. I realized that I'd found something I hadn't even known I was searching for, a sense of peace. A quiet confidence in who I was and where I was going. I was finally free, not just from the constraints of a relationship that hadn't served me, but from the self-doubt that had held me back for so long. The night sky stretched out above me, vast and limitless, and I knew that, like those stars above, my path was open, expansive, full of endless possibilities. I was ready to move forward, not with the urgency of someone trying to escape the past, but with the calm assurance of someone who had found their way home to themselves. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past finally lift, and in that moment, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be.